Wherever you are, we welcome you. Wherever you come from, we welcome you. Whomever you love, we welcome you. Whomever you love, we welcome you.
Good morning and welcome to the Unitarian-Universalist Church of Kent. I am Heidi Emhoff Wood, a member of this congregation and this morning's worship leader. Thank you for joining us this morning as we gather virtually once again, a spiritual community that seeks to be diverse and inclusive as we inspire love, work for justice, and grow together in community. We extend a special welcome to our visitors. Thank you for worshiping with us this morning. Visitors, if you would like to know more about our church and be in contact with us, there will be a contact link in the chat box at the end of the service. Everyone is welcome to use this link to be in contact with our staff and leadership about concerns or needs you may have.
Well, I woke up this morning with my mind, and it was stayed on freedom. Well, I woke up this morning with my mind, and it was stayed on freedom. Well, I woke up this morning with my mind, and it was stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Well, I was walking and talking with my mind, and it was stayed on justice. Well, I was walking and talking with my mind, and it was stayed on justice. Well, I was walking and talking with my mind, and it was stayed on justice. Well, hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Well, I was singing and praying with my mind, and it was stayed on equity. Well, I was singing and praying with my mind, and it was stayed on equity. Well, I was singing and praying with my mind, and it was stayed on equity. Well, hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Oh, well, there ain't no harm to keep your mind. Keep it stayed on compassion. Oh, well, there ain't no harm to keep your mind. Keep it stayed on compassion. Oh, well, there ain't no harm to keep your mind. Keep it stayed on compassion. Well, hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Well, hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
At the beginning of my journey exploring my own implicit bias, I read this book by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's backwards, isn't it? Between the World and Me. And I'd like to read an excerpt from it. And I encourage anyone who has not read this book to please pick it up and read it. No white person can know what it's like to be Black living in America, but this man bears his soul and his mind and shows us a little bit of what it's like. He says, I remember being amazed that death could so easily rise up from the nothing of a boyish afternoon, billow up like fog. I knew that West Baltimore, where I lived, that the north side of Philadelphia, where my cousins lived, that the south side of Chicago, where friends of my father lived, comprised a world apart. Somewhere out there beyond the firmament, past the asteroid belt, there were other worlds where children did not regularly fear for their bodies. I knew this because there was a large television resting in my living room. In the evenings, I would sit before this television, bearing witness to the dispatches from that other world. There were little white boys with complete collections of football cards, and their only want was a popular girlfriend, and their only worry was poison oak. That other world was suburban and endless, organized around pot roasts, blueberry pies, fireworks, ice cream sundaes, immaculate bathrooms, and small toy trucks that were loosed in wooded backyards with streams and glens. Comparing these dispatches with the facts of my native world, I came to understand that my country was a galaxy, and this galaxy stretched from the pandemonium of West Baltimore to the happy hunting grounds of Mr. Belvedere. I obsessed over the distance between that other sector of space and my own. I knew that my portion of the American galaxy, where bodies were enslaved by a tenacious gravity, was Black, and that the other liberated portion was not. I knew that some inscrutable energy preserved the breach. I felt, but did not yet understand the relation between that other world and me. And I felt in this a cosmic injustice, a profound cruelty, which infused an abiding, irrepressible desire to unshackle my body and achieve the velocity of escape.
I'm lighting our chalice today with the words of our newly adopted congregational commitment statement to racial justice. So I invite everyone to light your home chalice and join me in reading. As people of conscience, we uphold our Unitarian Universalist values of justice, equity, and compassion that call us to recognize the worth and dignity of all. We seek to become an inclusive congregation where everyone finds a sense of belonging. We pledge to do the uncomfortable work of confronting white supremacy and racial bias in ourselves and our institution. In order to be a catalyst for change, we will follow the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and will build partnerships with BIPOC organizations. We commit ourselves to bold action in ending systemic racism through uniting in witness, speaking courageously, advocating for institutional change, and participating in community action. We believe that only by liberating our collective souls from racism can the beloved community become reality. And on behalf of the Race for Justice team, I would like to thank the congregation for helping craft the statement and for approving it. And I will now share the abbreviated version or tagline as well. Our Unitarian Universalist Church of Kent commitment to racial justice, uniting in witness, speaking courageously, collaborating for freedom.
I invite us into a time of stillness to turn inward, to connect with the love that is the very heart of life itself, to reflect on the mysteries of life, and to remember once again that we are connected to each other and all of life as a part of the great interconnected web. Let us enter the silence. In the spirit of being a community of compassion and care, please use the chat box to share with us your sorrows and losses. Blaine Vasily shares thoughts and prayers for Vanessa's mother. Carol is expresses shares the anniversary this week of her mother's death from COVID, but shares that she's had many memories. Reverend Stephen wishes prayers for those injured in the Austin shooting and for an end to gun violence in this country. Larry Cole sends healing thoughts to Liz Bright's sister. Elaine Bowen says, during Pride Month, remembering 49 souls taken by murder at the Pulse nightclub 5 years ago today. Ooh. Yeah. Spirit of life and love, help us to see the light in our darkest of moments. Guide us in being compassionate listeners to griefs, sorrows, and struggles of others, to recognize when someone needs encouragement, compassion, or simply a hug, to know the difference between helping and listening. May we remember that each one of us has our struggles, but we are connected in the mystery and miracle of life and love. Amen and blessed be. And now you can use the chat box to express your joys. Becky Haynes is having a tie-dye party. Woo, fun. Rome family says, I got a sleepover with my best friend Ada for the first time in a year last week. Oh, good. That's from Evian. Michelle Boris says, my Hobbs goose beans are growing like crazy. Ooh. The Craver Deans remind us that today is the birth date of Olive Hobbs. She was born in 1922. We remember Olive with happiness. With gratitude for these and every blessing we receive in life, for the gift of life itself, for the companionship of one another on life's journey, for the hope and possibilities we discover together, may we say amen and blessed be.
If you attend RE classes, then you know that I often say, what can one young person do to change this world? We need only look back to the past for the stories of young people changing the future to be inspired to do the work that we must continue to do. In the fight for racial justice, thousands of young people made their mark. This is just one of those stories. Young Joanne did not know what her grandmother and the other adults in Selma, Alabama were so upset about. Joanne had already learned about freedom in school. She knew that in 1863, Abraham Lincoln had freed the slaves. So why was her grandmother going over to Brown Chapel day after day for meetings about fighting for freedom? At the Methodist chapel, songs were sung and plans were made. There was even training, as if it was a war. People were pushed and insulted on purpose so that they could practice not pushing or yelling back. This puzzled Joanne too. It seemed strange that her grandmother's freedom fighting involved keeping calm, acting peaceful, and not fighting. One day, Grandma took Joanne to Selma's downtown to get new shoes. Joanne saw a pair that she liked and she tried them on. The shoes were too big, so her grandmother asked for a smaller size. But the store clerk said no. The clerk demanded that Grandma buy the pair that didn't fit. They had to, she said, because no white person would ever buy them after Joanne's foot had been inside. They walked to Carter's drugstore next, and through the window, Joanne could see the clean, shiny lunch counter where children her age were treated to ice cream sundaes and served by a waitress. She desperately wanted to sit there. When we get our freedom, her grandmother said. And that's when Joanne understood. The adults were fighting for freedom to sit at that counter, to enjoy a nice ice cream on a hot day, and to try on shoes without being belittled or harassed. Soon Joanne became a freedom fighter too. She was just 8 years old when she began. She began marching for Black voting rights. In February of 1965, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Selma to lead a demonstration in a peaceful march. When the police began to hit and arrest people, Joanne was one of the children taken to jail. She is the youngest recorded child to have been arrested. Surrounding Joanne in the jail were familiar people, young and old, many from the George Washington Carver housing project where she lived. She had known they could be arrested and did not know what could come next, but was determined for another step towards freedom. Joanne marched again on March 7th with several hundred people planning to walk more than 50 miles to Alabama's capital city, Montgomery. But police would not let the marchers over the bridge out of Selma. They were attacked by the police. The police had weapons, and some were on horses. The marchers scattered, and Joanne heard screaming and crying all around her. It was a scary time. And the next thing she knew, she woke in a car with her head on her sister's lap. She thought that she felt tears from her sister, only to realize that her sister had been injured. This is the day that history remembers as Bloody Sunday. The next march to Montgomery 2 weeks later ended with a rousing speech by Dr. King at the state capitol, and Joanne was a part of that march too. Joanne Bland still lives in Selma today. As times have changed, she had always found new ways to be a freedom fighter. In 1993, she co-founded the National Voting Rights Museum, where anyone can come and learn about the events that happened in Selma, why the march happened, what was accomplished, and what remains to be done. Now retired from the museum, still to this day, she guides educational tours along the very streets she lived in the fight for freedom in 1965. Joanne Bland was very special. She was one of thousands of children and young people who fought for liberation, making history, each one making the world a better place. I wonder if you will look up a story of one of the other children and young people sometime this week. Perhaps you'll learn the story of James Stewart or Arnetta Steeler Gray, or Minnie Jean Brown, or Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Thelma Mothershed, Melba Patilla, Gloria Ray, Terrence Roberts, Jefferson Thomas, Carlotta Walls. What can one person do? We can learn their stories and be inspired by young people making their mark.
My first reading is an excerpt from the Me and White Supremacy curriculum by Layla Saad. You may be wondering why I chose to use the words white supremacy, not something softer or less confrontational, like internalized racism or unconscious bias. You may be thinking that white supremacy is a term that is only used to describe far-right extremists and neo-Nazis. However, this idea that white supremacy only applies to the so-called bad ones is both incorrect and dangerous, because it reinforces the idea that white supremacy is an ideology that is only upheld by a fringe group of white people. White supremacy is far from fringe. In white-dominated societies and communities, it is the dominant paradigm that forms the foundation from which norms, rules, and laws are created. So what is white supremacy? According to Merriam-Webster, white supremacy or white supremacism is the belief that the white race is inherently superior to other races and that white people should have control over people of other races. It is the social, economic, and political systems that collectively enable white people to maintain power over people of other races. You may hear that definition and think that it doesn't apply to you, that you don't hold that belief, but rather you believe that all of us are equal and that you don't modify your treatment of people based on the color of their skin. White supremacy is an ideology, a paradigm, an institutional system, and a worldview that you have been born into by virtue of your whiteness. I am not talking about the physical color of your skin being bad. I am talking about the historic and modern legislating, societal conditioning, and systemic institutionalizing of the construction of whiteness as inherently superior than people of other races. Yes, outwardly racist systems of oppression like slavery, Jim Crow, and apartheid have been abolished, but the discrimination, marginalization, abuse, and killing of BIPOC in white-dominated communities continues even today, because white supremacy continues to be the dominant paradigm under which white societies operate. So we must call a thing a thing. We must look directly at the ways in which this racist ideology of white supremacy, this idea that white equals better, superior, more worthy, more credible, more deserving, and more valuable, actively harms anyone who does not own white privilege. And we must look at the ways that this plays out at an individual, personal, and intimate level within you as a person. It is so easy to blame the system out there for creating this oppression, but the system was created by individual people, and it is upheld by individual people, whether knowingly or unknowingly. If you are willing to dare to look white supremacy right in the eye and see yourself reflected back, you are going to become better equipped to dismantle it within yourself and within your communities. Now we are going to hear a personal reflection from Mary Ann Stevens.
Good morning. My long and circuitous journey towards racial justice began in the place of my birth, Texas, in the mid-1940s, 20 years before segregation was legally abolished. Most people in thinking about Texas think about cowboys and oil wells. Rarely are the images of the state's enslavement of African people, the Jim Crow policies and laws, and the continuing oppression of Blacks ever told. I was never told those stories. And I really wonder how my development might have been different if I had known about them. I grew up in a culture where discrimination and prejudice surrounded me, and I couldn't figure it out until my late teen years. As a child, I was immersed in anti-Black racism through my family members, my friends, the schools, and yes, even my church. It was not hard for society to teach a child these attitudes or for a child to learn them. They were everywhere. They had to do with who could enter, where one could sit, who could be hired, and just essentially who was of value. It just didn't make sense. The only Black people I ever had contact with were the women who cleaned our home. I found these people to be quite likable, and I wondered why we didn't like people of their race. I had developed a strong sense of what was fair and just, and this all just didn't seem right. And of course, I knew never ask questions. By the rounding this time, I had a lightning bolt of clarity hit me. I realized I wasn't confused at all. And in fact, I was seeing things for what they were. Discrimination and prejudice were morally wrong, and I decided my life was going to take a different path. My freshman year in college in the early 1960s was the first time I had ever had contact with Black peers. I learned that some of my Black dorm mates had parents who were actually lawyers and physicians and business professionals, things I could have never imagined. My world was expanding and I was awakening to a new reality. Living in Alabama in the late 1960s, I got actively involved in racial justice work, including the war on poverty, school desegregation, and of course, the Unitarian Church. Especially in the rural areas, I witnessed a side of life I had only seen in National Geographic photos of third world countries. The extreme poverty in some of the homes I visited was appalling, and it broke my heart. But even among my Black professional friends in Alabama, I was coming to see that the white culture that had shaped my early life was so harmful to so many. Fast forward in time, I was married, I was a parent, a graduate student, and then I was immersed in my career. Throughout this time, I was keenly aware that society had not changed as much or in the direction that I had hoped, but time and energy just simply were not available for me to get so actively involved again. And besides, I honestly didn't know what I would do if I did have the time and energy. About 10 years ago, I began reading about whiteness, a concept that had not been a part of my early racial awakening. I was beginning to learn that the problem was much bigger than the overt discrimination I had been aware of in my earlier time. I then, and exploring more deeply, and once again, lightning struck. I began to see that the problem was far more fundamental and pernicious than I could have ever imagined. I saw that the problem was largely due to a social system that was built by and for white people based on the assumption that white culture is superior. Importantly, I recognized that this system can only be maintained by the actions and attitudes of white people, knowingly or accidentally, that continue to oppress Black people. I was discovering that I had a problem that I didn't know I had, and I wanted to fix it. The problem had just been invisible to me. Fixing the problem requires me to engage in some very uncomfortable self-examination, to listen carefully to the sometimes very painful experiences of people of color, and to work earnestly to change. My anti-racism work has become my spiritual work. And like all spiritual work, it is an ongoing process. I am blessed to be a part of this church community where I'm encouraged to continually grow my spiritual life through racial justice work, and where I can collaborate with others to help build a world where people, all people, can truly live with justice and equity, and where we can all have a sense of compassion for one another.
My second reading is an excerpt from Ravenna native Miss Marche Greer on collective liberation. Ubuntu. One translation of this South African word is, I am because we are. In other words, we exist because our communities exist. In a world that tries to convince us that individualism is the only way, Ubuntu reminds us that we need each other, that our self-understanding should be shaped by what our community has given us and what we can give to it. Many people are calling for unity in our country in response to the blatant white supremacy on display everywhere from our neighborhoods to the Capitol building. Some are saying that if we can just agree to disagree, even with people who seek to kill us, that all will be well. I've learned that people who want you to sacrifice your humanity for unity don't actually care about unity. They care about ensuring your servitude. As writer Robert Jones Jr. said, we can agree to disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. As a Christian theologian, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was clear that not all peace is created equally. In Matthew 5:9, in his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." Reverend Dr. King's call to create beloved community was not a call for us to try to get along with people who don't care if we live or die, because Dr. King was a peacemaker, not a peacekeeper. While peacekeepers maintain order at all costs, peacemakers pursue freedom at all costs. Peacemakers know that in order for true peace to exist in the world, equity must exist for all people. Peacemakers imagine a world where we can all survive and thrive, and they fight with all they have to create that world. Peacemakers know that the only way to freedom is through collective liberation. Collective liberation is a type of freedom that knows our destinies, lives, and communities are all intertwined. Collective liberation says until the most marginalized and stigmatized among us are free, none of us are free. Here are 3 thoughts on how we get free together. Number 1, we end disposability and center accountability. Too many of our systems are designed to convince us that it's okay to throw people away. But doing so will require us living into more accountable ways of being together. We can't stay silent about the harm that happens in our communities if we want to heal it. We have to build more resilient relationships that can hold complexity, conflict, and truth-telling. Number 2, each of us needs to claim our roles in our own communities with pride. Ella Baker said, "Strong people don't need strong leaders." In other words, we don't need one hero to save us. The strongest movements and the strongest communities have many people willing to live into many roles to support the whole. Maybe you're a healer or an elder or a mediator. Don't worry about showing up perfectly. Just keep showing up in your purpose. And number 3, we must nurture creativity. Pursuing liberation requires so much creativity. Many of us are here because people did things that seemed beyond the realm of possibility so that we might have a chance to thrive. People often dismiss bold imaginings of a free future as naive. And when I'm tempted to let go of our hopes for a better tomorrow, I remember that the point of oppression is to kill our dreams, because when we stop dreaming, we stop believing things can change. And when we stop believing things can change, we stop working for that change. Now we are going to hear a personal reflection from Sonis Parsons.
Hello. When I was in early elementary school, I was with my mom on a sunny and sweltering summer day when a large parking lot in Kansas City. Once in the car while waiting for the air conditioner to kick in, I noticed something weird happening above the hood of the car. Objects I could see through the windshield were all distorted, wavy, and shimmery. My mom explained that because everything was so hot outside, it was heating up the air, making it expand and rise. It was this lighter, expanding air that I was looking through, and that's why everything looked wavy. This was a revelation to me. I'd heard about air, of course, but it was invisible and odorless and tasteless. You couldn't touch it. I'd heard about it, but it just didn't seem like a real thing to me. This experience was significant because it made some theoretical, invisible thing suddenly visible and therefore real. In time, I came to realize that there were other ways to experience air as well. A dust devil in New Mexico that formed next to our car and then whirled through it. A rising column of hot air in a Kansas hayfield that carried huge swirling things of hay up into the air hundreds of feet above us. I learned how to recognize and feel air pressure. I learned to recognize that air was all around me, active, heavy, and mostly invisible unless you knew how to see it. Why would I tell you this anecdote when the topic today is supposed to be around racial justice and the second principle? Here's why. Early on in my journey towards racial wholeness, I was absolutely sure that I was not a racist. The history of slavery repulsed me. I really thought that all this trouble around race was because of individual animosity. I had grown up in other countries, in other cultures. I was exposed to people who looked, talked, dressed, and worshiped differently from me. My parents taught tolerance and equality. In high school, I loved a handsome youth with dark skin and curly black hair who always smelled of cocoa butter. I belonged to a club called Students United for Racial Equality. There was just no way I could be prejudiced. It was other people. And when I went to my first real anti-racism workshop, that's basically what I said in so many words. I was desperate for everyone there to know that I was not a racist like other people. I was one of the good guys. But the more I learned, the more I came to understand that I had been affected more than I realized. I began to realize that racism and its effects were all around me and even inside of me, but that it had been invisible to me. It's just a tiny example of a bias I discovered in myself quite by accident. A few years ago, I began playing Words with Friends on my phone. I remember early on noticing that there were tons of Black people who were playing Words with Friends. I noticed it because I was surprised at how many there were. Somehow, somewhere, I had picked up the notion that Black people wouldn't enjoy word games. Further reflection led me to recognize that I had assumed Black people wouldn't enjoy word games because they did poorly in school, didn't enjoy school, didn't read well, and consequently wouldn't like word games. Bias, lurking right there inside of me. If I was oblivious to my own biases around race, I was completely blind when I first learned the term systemic racism or institutional racism. Again, I just could not imagine it would be true. How could it happen in this day and age without anyone noticing? Gradually, the outlines and systems of widespread institutional racism began to become visible to me. For example, I learned about the practice of redlining, where people of color will confined to homes within neighborhoods where they would be more comfortable, and discouraged or prevented from buying homes in affluent or white areas. Of course, getting a loan for that home was often impeded by a job that wasn't stable enough or with enough pay. And getting a loan with a good rate was hard to do because homes in the redlined neighborhoods weren't considered a good risk either. Schools in those areas didn't get the same financial support and didn't attract the same kinds of teachers as more affluent neighborhoods. And because such neighborhoods are often considered dangerous, they're apt to be heavily policed. Stop and frisk and random traffic stops with searches and seizures increase the chances of getting into trouble with the police for things that in other neighborhoods would never be caught. Once in the judicial system, the outcomes didn't seem to be equal either. And once those scales fell from my eyes, I could see the evidence of it all around me. The second principle calls us to support justice and equity, but it also calls us to compassion. Once I was able to see the effects of racism in the world around me, I knew it would be impossible for me to ignore it any longer. And I also knew that compassion called me to acknowledge that these social ills actually exist. They harm others and they harm me. Ignoring them or trying to explain them away is called gaslighting, and it just adds another layer of injury to all the other kinds of harm. I know this is hard to do. It's hard to sit still and hear about this, to know that if we aren't actively trying to work against racism, then we are part of the perpetuation of it. This is hard to accept, but I'm learning to lean into the discomfort, to sit with the truths that are revealed and share what I learn with others. I'm heartened that many in this congregation have expressed the willingness to share in this work as well. Let us move towards justice and equity together and show compassion to others affected by this scourge.
Although we cannot be together in person yet, we are strong and thriving as a community and able to be together virtually for worship, for community, for shared ministry because of the gifts of money, time, and care each of you so generously give. Thank you. To help others in our community thrive, we also give to agencies and organizations in Kent and beyond that serve those in need. June's special offering is for Love Light. Love Light is a social service agency in Kent that was formed in 1995 to assist individuals and families, especially those who are lower income or otherwise disadvantaged, to move forward towards the actualization of their potential. One of the services Love Light provides is a summer program that includes games, art, learning, opportunities, and lunch for more than 100 children and youth. In the spirit of gratitude for the gift of one another and this community and the abundance that makes this generosity possible, we now give and receive the offering as a sign of our shared commitment to the life and work of this congregation and beyond.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. truth will make us free. The truth will make us free. The truth will make us free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday.
As I extinguish our shared chalice, please extinguish your home chalice and join me in saying the words on the screen. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. May we carry these in our hearts and minds until we are together again.
The Reverend Alan Bosak of South Africa, who fought against apartheid, once said that when we go before God at the end of our lives to be judged, God will ask, "Where are your wounds?" Too many of us will say, "We have no wounds." Then God will ask, "Was nothing worth fighting for?" Please join in singing the Song of Blessing and Sending, Go on Your Way in Peace, with the Golden Tones Junior Choir.